I want to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. As a CEO, there are days when my calendar feels like a never-ending cascade of decisions, meetings, and problems to solve. Days when I can't remember if I've eaten lunch. The last thing I have time to think about is currency exposure. This is where Alt21 can help by taking the complexity out of foreign exchange. With their FX and hedging platform, you can lock in exchange rates and automate payments. And with their low fees, up to 90% less than competitors, you'll save money while freeing up your time for what really matters. If you want to stop juggling and start focusing on growing your business, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Neural, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Fred Destin, is founder of Stride VC, an artisan seed fund currently investing out of its second £124 million fund. Before Stride, Fred was general partner at Excel and Accomplice, formerly as Atlas Venture. He was the lead investor and board member at Cazoo, Deliveroo, Integral Ad Science and Zoopla, all of which IPO'd, and PillPack and the Currency Cloud, which were respectively acquired by Amazon and Visa for $1 and $4 billion. Fred, a huge welcome and thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure, Ali.
Fred, I'd love to start by talking to you about the value that you see board members creating on startup boards. And I'd be particularly interested to hear from you some of the transformational sliding door moments for those of your most high-profile investments where you think the board got it right.
The first one I'll mention is Zoopla. And of course, Zoopla, we have the benefit of a pretty phenomenal entrepreneur in the person of Alex Chesterman. But Zoopla's got three interesting moves that it made, all of which led to the eventual IPO and then the sale for $3 billion to private equity. So the first one is we started actually with an objective of disrupting real estate agents, which very few people know. We were basically trying to be a sort of direct marketplace for real estate. And Alex and I realized, I think after 4 months, that this was a terrible idea. So the first move was to pivot quickly and just realize that we were pushing water up a hill and just drop our entire initial plan and just say, you know what, we're going to make the existing market more efficient rather than try and disrupt it. So that was number one. Number two was that when we were an early stage business, Zoopla was basically built as an SEO engine combined with free pricing tools, so better buyer intelligence, and then higher quality listings in the sense that the listing product itself was more beautiful. And we executed really well on that. We had one small issue, which is we had absolutely no revenue and quite a slow conversion rates because I think we were player number 5 or 6 by revenue in the market at that time. And when News Corp decided to divest findaproperty.com, I mean, we had absolutely no business acquiring that company, but we decided to go right for it and do whatever it would take to acquire that business. So we ended up getting our hands on £8 million of annual revenue. Kind of nobody wanted to buy it because it was burning $3 million a year and had been for quite a long time. So people thought of it as some kind of damaged asset. What I think they didn't realize is it had many years of established real estate relationship with the agents, which means it had quite a high recurring revenue, just wasn't finding any way to make money. Anyway, we combined both entities, and I think within 90 days, we brought the entire group to cash flow break even or close to that. So it was pretty radical because not only did we become number 2 overnight in terms of revenue, but on top of that, we sort of got a cash flow break even company. That's all tactical. The third move is the most interesting one that the company did, which was much more strategic, which is we said, okay, what does it take to really win in this market? So think of applying the 7 powers. Think of how you line up a strategic competitive advantage that's going to last. So we went to see the top 5 agents in the country and we said, here's a 10-year contract combined with opening up 30% of the capital in the company. So absolutely massive equity opening. And if you get into these 10-year contracts with us, we will distribute a third of the business to you as shareholders and we'll bring you onto the board. So the point of that was to say, we're going to replicate what Rightmove did back in the day. We'll make you rich on the equity on top of providing great service. And 3 of the top 5 took up the offer, came into the cap table. So Countrywide, LSL, and Connell. So I think we had 1, 2, and 4 that ended up coming in. And lo and behold, we were now aligned with the biggest players in the industry and locked down mode for 10 years. So no way for Rightmove to take these customers away from us. We basically established the undisputed number 2 in the market kind of overnight. Now, what's interesting is most people would never have thought about giving away that much equity or to let people who you're competing and collaborating with into your cap table, sort of letting the fox in the hen house. But actually, it was very symbiotic, and I think it's partly what made the company happen. And Zoopla went public on roughly 14 million pounds of capital raised, which is insane, about, half of which came from me, partly because we made these moves.
It reminds me actually of a play that I saw from Grey Goose. I remember talking to one of the investors in Grey Goose where they were trying to compete with Smirnoff. And they had a similar insight where when people order a vodka and Coke, no one actually says, I want a Smirnoff and Coke. They just say vodka and Coke. So they incentivized all the bartenders with some sort of bonus scheme to when someone asked for a vodka and Coke to make sure that it was a Grey Goose. And it meant that they sort of took a good share in that market very quickly. But I mean, that's an incredibly bold move, offering 30% of the equity and the 10-year contract. Was that something you debated for a long time? What were the arguments against doing that at the time?
So I think of markets as a chessboard. Maybe not at the beginning, but when you're working within oligopoly environments, etc., there's only so many moves you can make on the chessboard. And we were sitting there looking at our competition. And at the time, there were probably 6 or 7 meaningful players, much of which belonged to press. They were like, what is the move that ends the game? And we knew right moves are going to be extremely hard to catch. I mean, by far and away the market leader, but how do we establish an undisputed number 2? And you're kind of trying to let go of any preconceived notion and just say rationally, how much equity value can we create by giving away a third of the company? Let's not get emotional about this. What's the trade-off that we're making? What are the states of nature in the future that would justify making such a move? And for sure, it was debated for a long time, but I don't think we had disagreement on it. I think we're trying to think together about what the shape of that thing might look like.
Was that purely an econ shareholding, or did they also have voting rights? Because my experience of having customers on boards has always been negative, and you alluded to the pain of that.
The reason why this worked is because we had the CEOs of these companies on the board. And this is where Alex, of course, is a master, which is we didn't have head of corp dev or strategy or even the finance director. These were the CEOs of the company. And so it allowed us to keep the conversation at the right strategic level, and also reflected the strategic nature of what was happening in the market. So I think it worked because they weren't really customers. I mean, they're really the players in the industry. The people moving the pieces on the chessboard were all together in one room. So that's why it probably transcended what you'd normally expect from these setups, which are normally terrible. Which goes to show, by the way, that whatever rule you think needs to apply it only take one case when it does not apply. And startups are always like that, right? It's always the exception that makes you succeed.
Can we go back to something you touched on earlier, which was the sharpness of the strategy and the signals that you were measuring on the board compared to findaproperty.com? What were they? Because I think that's something so many board members wrestle with, trying to get it down to those really few key variables.
We're talking about years ago, right? Because this company was sold many years ago, but I will try and remind myself. We had a financial set of metrics and a KPI set of metrics. The financial set of metrics fundamentally looked at our free cash flow generation and tried to look at customer health. So we were tracking revenue per agency, number of active agencies, how many we churned, how many we added. So there was a decent amount of detail on existing revenue generation and upsells. And then we were tracking fairly precisely our marketing performance at a financial level, because this was pretty fundamental to the company. By the way, some of these are monthly. Marketing efficiency is not a monthly, because you'd just be looking at your current cohort. So this is where there might be a decent amount of complexity underneath, but you're really looking at your CLTV, your payback times, etc. Even though the rest of the reporting was monthly, this was not. So you were kind of meshing the two. And then the operational metrics had a lot to do with the number of leads we were generating for our clients, the effective cost per lead of the clients that we were sending them. So a lot had to do with frontline indicators of customer health. What I would observe as well is that very often people are looking at lagging indicators of how the business is doing. So if you wait for financials to come and tell you a poor story, you kind of miss the beat. So for example, customer health, I mean, is something that I don't think is tracked that systematically. I'm like, this is what it's all about. It's like, what value are you delivering to the customers? Are they loving it? And if you're going to start running into trouble, what are the early indicators we need to be looking at? Because otherwise you're driving from the backseat.
Other board members, and I know you've touched on that there's boards that are collective rather than an individual game, but were there other board members who stood out for you on that journey, or indeed maybe a journey on some of the other portfolio that you've been involved with, for the individual value creation they added? And are there patterns across those people?
So let me call out a couple of people that are quite different. So one would be a recent addition to my roster of people I've worked with, which is a gentleman called Dave Kellogg. And Dave was a CEO, a CMO, and is a blogger. He blogs a lot actually about good boards and good strategy. And he has recently joined the board of TechWolf. Dave is one of these guys that puts everybody to shame because he's just so competent around such a range of topic. And so this is the beauty of a strong non-exec, that he can, I mean, he's particularly strong in sales and marketing, but he can operate across the entire range of what a company needs as an experienced operator. What sets him apart, I think, one is systems thinking. So he has frameworks for thinking about the problems he's looking at, which I love because I'm the same. So we connect on that. And then this sort of enthusiasm that he brings. So the second person I want to call out is another David Frankel, who's from Founder Collective in Boston, who's on the board of PillPack with me. And David's an investor, but he's a former entrepreneur. But anyway, background doesn't really matter. He just came with energy and passion and enthusiasm and curiosity and very fast clock speed. And so the board at PillPack was TJ and Elliot, the two co-founders, me and David. And we were just riffing. I mean, this thing was like an ideas factory. To the point that when the Series C came along, a gentleman from CRV, George Zachary is amazing. And George just looked at us and went, this board's great. I was just like, not going to touch it. You guys are doing fine. And so the commonality between the two is a sort of infectious enthusiasm about what the business is doing, and I think I've seen this a lot in great board members. It's like, they're actually really passionate about what the company's doing. And, so if you come in and you say, oh, the building is burning, everything's on fire, my co-founder just left, which, by the way, is what startups are. I mean, they're in a constant state of chaos. But if everybody's like, all right, cool, we still love you, let's get to work, let's fix it. That just general attitude is something where the founders feel like no matter what hell they're walking through, there's people walking with them. And I think what's also interesting is it then gives you permission to be a lot more, quote unquote, challenging, if you like. I don't like the word challenging, but to be much more engaged and have the real conversations, because the founders can feel where you're coming from. You're coming from a place of, I'm going to use a soft word, love, like actual love, like I love the business, I love the team, I love what you're doing. Let's go. And then when things go rough, you can kind of still be in that place, but have the real conversation, because you're in a place where trust and truth are allowed to blossom. And if you have trust, which trust is a delicate thing to build within a startup board, right? But if you have trust, you can do anything together in so much of a better way. So I think these are people that foster that kind of energy, and it's beautiful.
That echoes a couple of recent conversations I've had, one with Christian Unger, who's responsible for the boards of Partners Group, which is later stage sort of private equity. And he identified two characteristics that were common to their highest performing boards. One was they were best at distilling what the key KPIs or strategic initiatives were, but the second was the amount of time they spent on the business. And I guess that's probably the other side of the coin of that passion. If you're really passionate about something, you do spend that time on it.
Yeah. And the curiosity part. So here's one observation I have on failure modes of boards. People just don't know enough about the business. So it's really difficult to have high quality conversations if you don't fundamentally understand what the company does. And very often this is put down to, oh, they're not from the sector, or, they don't have the right expertise and background. All this focus on fixed characteristics like expertise and background for me is somewhat irrelevant. You just need to go learn. And, until you've understood it, keep asking questions. I mean, these businesses are not, we're not talking about the next generation battery technology. And, if you don't have to be a chemist, you just have to go understand what the mechanics of the business are, what the reality of the business is, what the reality of the team is. And so keep learning. And until you've learned enough that you feel that you can be a competent board member, just keep on learning. And there's too little of that. So the idea of being curious shows that you care, and your rate of learning is a lot higher. And then you go in with this mindset of, I don't know anything about your business. In fact, what I think I knew 3 months ago has probably changed today. So I'm still going to go in with a learning mindset, with a curious mindset. I'm going to go into, in fact, every interaction with a curious mindset. And there's way too little of that.
It fascinates me. One of the things that we do in the New Role Plus community is we have these mastermind groups where people bring a challenge that they're facing as a board member, and they get peer support from the group. And the way we set them up is we have the first hour of the session only asking questions, and it's built on the Michael Bungay-Stanier insight that never give advice because you probably haven't understood the problem. If you've understood the problem, you probably haven't got the solution. And if you've understood the problem and you got the solution, they're not going to listen to you anyway. And so that first hour of just asking questions is about making sure you really understand the problem. And what fascinates me is how few board members are able to do that. They are jumping in so quickly to give their suggestions. And it's amazing how difficult people find that to be genuinely curious.
So let's pause on that for a minute, because I think it's very important. What is the likelihood that I, as an investor and board member, have thought more deeply and understand more about a complex problem inside the business than the person running it? Now, they may not have the answer because they might be stuck in a fog of complexity, but the answer is somewhere within them. And am I going to be more efficient if I allow them to go discover the answer that they already know? So let me ask interesting questions or probing questions. Let me offer a distinction. Let me bring in an analog from another company that I was at and say, does that, are you linking concepts? And if they own the solution, first of all, they probably know it. So it's really just a question of like, where is it inside of you? Like, can we take some of the fog away so you can see the sun again or the shape of the hills? And number two, if they own it, if it's their discovery, they're much more likely to do something about it. So if you can take yourself out of the equation, this is not about you, and you just become a conduit by which the founders or the founding team discover things they already know, like you're doing great. On occasion, once in a blue moon, you might see something clearly. By the way, you might still be wrong, but you should at least phrase it. Sometimes I have very strong intuition. I'm like, I'm really not sure that the second market we're going after can be effectively married with the first. And here's the questions I'm asking myself. So if you have strong intuition, by all means, bring it to the fore. But man, I mean, advice is hard. Good advice is harder. And like you said, if you give it to people, they probably won't do it anyway. So yeah, I love that. I think that's very wise. And I think people would do well to spend time on that. By the way, which brings me to my second point, this obsession with value add, which I have detected on your podcast, I find super damaging. And I'm happy to explain to you why in a minute. But I think it is a little bit of a red herring, at least when it comes to investor directed.
Explore that a bit. Tell me more.
So we think we are constantly framing the discussion around, was a board member valuable or good or not, around did they add value? And A, that's transactional. But B, more importantly, it doesn't reflect the reality of the relationship at a ground level. So we are asking people to be value add. We're therefore putting them sort of under the spotlight to say, did you provide value? And so we're sort of creating the conditions by which people feel obliged to kind of give you an intro and provide some advice and all that stuff. And I see this all the time. And this is sort of errant behavior where people are doing investor intros that are not to the right funds or that are too far ahead of the fundraising cycle just because they want to or maybe they have a need to help. They have their own internal emotional need to be seen helpful, which has nothing to do with the company, or they just want to win at the value add Olympics. Okay, cool. So let's just forget value add for a second and let's just look at what the board does. Number one, in startups, you have a board by virtue of the law and your shareholder agreements. So you have a board whether you want it or not. And that board has to do some fundamental things like approving strategy, not setting strategy, by the way, but reviewing, maybe questioning and approving strategy. Same with the budget, which is effectively the allocation of cash. Fundraising, so where you find the cash, where you allocate the cash. And then things like exit, shutdown, and litigation. So you have these, call them existential questions on which the board needs to be functional and effective. None of that has to do with value add. So first of all, can we do that well? Can we do these core questions of strategy, budget approval, fundraising, exit, shutdown, and litigation properly? Okay, then you have a level up from that, which would be how are you doing? How's the leadership doing? Are we serving our customers the right way? Are we focused on the right things? Like the big questions. Are we focused on the right things? Do we deeply understand what we are about? Are we serving our customers? Which very often, by the way, they get forgotten because you're internally focused and you're developing product. And then you kind of go like, hey, did you forget your clients in the context of developing your product? So there's this, call them existential questions. Then you have what I would call foundational pillars. One very important one in startups is narratives. Do we understand the story? Do we know why we're doing the things we do? So purpose, mission, vision, and narrative. And can we tell that story well? Can we tell it to our employees, to our prospective employees, to our customers, to the market? Do we have the narrative down? From there, culture and values. The most defensible competitive advantage most of our companies have is culture and values. Have we thought about it? Have we been intentional about it? Have we gone beyond stupid keywords to actually codify actionable culture statements that we can then turn into values through rituals? And it's very valuable, right? Then we get into things like organization design. With the cash that we have, who do we need to hire by when? Then you might get into things like talent in general, which is one of the ways I find boards quite helpful, is to reflect back and say, your VP sales, I don't know, I'm not making statements about him or her, but I have seen this kind of behavior before and I've got orange flags flying. You need to be on watch because I think this person might be sandbagging you or whatever. Very often, you will have pattern recognition around humans a little bit faster than founders might have, also because they're biased, right? Because they need to hire people. Anyway, so, okay, I don't know if we're in the value add space just yet. We're having interesting conversations about what the pillars of the company look like. Okay, then you get into functional stuff like sales and marketing, GTM, pricing, price strategy, talent strategy, HR strategy. So now we're getting slightly higher up in the stack in terms of functional capabilities. Then we get into value add, quote unquote, which is, do you have a great network of talent? Can you intro me to customers? And maybe can you intro me to other funds? So I just want to say one word on that. What is the likelihood? I have a company in my portfolio, which is a beautiful company called Kashmir Intelligence. And they're building world models for things like refineries and heavy industry. So this is a deep learning AI company. Okay, they need access to people who run operations optimization inside refineries. What is the likelihood that any of us can give them access to the right customer at the right time? So some of our investors have done a bunch of intros to oil companies, but they're in some kind of digital innovation division in London, whereas they're trying to be in operations in North America, and those two people don't even know each other. So the likelihood that you as a multifaceted investor will come up with the right network of talent, customers, etc., on a reliable basis strikes me as the mother of all misaligned expectations or oversold capacities, because it is really hard to do that reliably well. I mean, unless you're a deep fintech expert and you know everybody in fintech in London, more power to you. So I think value add is a dangerous framing because it almost forgets everything else that we need to do before we get to value add. And, most of the venture industry in Europe are not ex-founders. By the way, I'm happy to go into operators versus founders because I think they're quite different animals. The best board member for a startup is a founder who is strategic and who's actually built a company and understands strategically how to build a company. That's really hard to build, especially if on top of that, the transaction experience and they're quite financially minded, you've got a winner. So that's your unicorn board member.
There's data supporting that as well. I think they did it in Sweden.
I'm sure anyone that's not that profile, it may be lacking on some sort of scale, right? Okay, so most VCs are not ex-operators. If they were ex-operators, let's remember that their value, their relevance in terms of operational experience is going to fall off a cliff, right? Like the value of your network falls off a cliff. What you know is company building techniques. I mean, we're in a world of AI now. What you've learned 5 years ago might actually be counterproductive. So this also decays. So we kind of focused on these fixed characteristics, and most of the venture industry are investors anyway. So unless you have a magic wand and we can all turn them into founders, I mean, that's the pool. So the question then is, okay, if I'm a VC today and my capital is looking more and more like commodity, which it is, and I'm trying to win deals, what are the skills that I can work on as an individual to make myself a better board member? And these skills are not the skills that I use to hunt deals and to close deals and to get on the Midas list and to provide advice about whatever the tariffs on LinkedIn. They're a different set of skills. They're skills of deep listening, strategic thinking, framework thinking. You're basically what I would say is like you don't exist. Ideally, you don't even exist. And you're just looking laterally at what's going on. What is the information that I'm getting from the company? What is happening in the dynamic of the people around the room? What is the market we're operating in? You're trying to sit there with basically the broadest possible viewpoint, like kind of relaxing your gaze, so to speak, and looking very broadly and going, what is going on here? And what will be meaningful to help this company be successful in this particular moment? Not in general, but I mean, what does this company need at this point in time? Does it need a big strategy session because we're flating about on strategy? Do we need to hire a new head of sales? Do we need to do nothing at all? Do we need to just be patient and consistent? And so it's like what is required in the moment for the company? That's really the question. And then it's not like whether or not you can contribute to that. Simply identifying that's what's needed is already great.
If you're listening to these conversations and thinking, I'd love someone to guide me through my own board journey, that's exactly what New Role Plus offers. Personalized advice, expert feedback, and someone in your corner as you build towards your next role. Head to plus.newrole.com to find out more. It's interesting the way you talk about value add, because it sounds like very, as you say, sort of tactical introductions. But, the examples you were giving earlier, like narratives, really sung to me, because that's something where I've been on a journey as an operator, having been an investor before. I didn't ever fully appreciate how important that was. And, now every all hands we have, I start with a reminder of, our vision and mission and why are we doing this. And I think someone once said to me, if you haven't said something 10 times, you haven't said it. And, when you're growing, you constantly forget that, a significant proportion of the room have never heard you say it before. I suppose the way I think about that is that your role as a board member and as a board is to ensure that the organization is well run. It's the executive responsibility to run the business, or the founder's responsibility to run the business. It's as a board member. And so I see that as value add. If you are really able to help a founder thinking about crafting the narrative and how to distribute the narrative across the organization systematically, that is huge value add. Is that consistent with the way you think about it?
So, okay, let me take this at two levels. It so happens that I adore strategy and I love narrative and clear storytelling. And, when people ask you what's your superpower, my superpower is deriving simplicity out of complexity. That's what I do best, right? And so very often I will I'll just listen. I'll take in as much input as possible. And then I will articulate back what I think I understood and possibly reframe it a little bit. And you just see how that lands. So there's a lot of just mirroring, talking back, that kind of stuff. If I knew nothing about strategy and sucked at it, I could still say, could you explain to me what's the 3-sentence version of what the company does that you would tell an incoming employee? And just listen. And then go, did that resonate for everybody in the room? And then probably the CTO will go, I think it sucks that we didn't talk about it for 6 months. You're like, okay, cool. How much of an issue is this? And then usually the founder will say, you know what? I don't really like it, but I don't know how to frame this thing. And I need help around it. It's like, okay, cool. So we have some form of narrative issue. Well, how do we fix it? And, then we might brainstorm. So let's not look for solutions now, but what do we think are the elements that will go into the omelette here of like the language we can use? And cool. Okay. All right. So we've defined the problem a little bit better now. At least we know what shape it's got. And then let's go figure out, maybe I can help you because I love doing it, or let's just go find out somebody who can, or maybe you guys can take 4 hours out of your day and go brainstorm this thing together and come back with something that's a little bit more shape. So at that point, you've done nothing magical except, just like, what is the quality of the question you've asked, right? Ask great questions. And then what's the quality of the conversation we're having about it? This is not hard in the sense that you just need to go like, okay, what's needed in this moment? And you can feel it, if you're paying attention. I'll give you an example. I was in this company called Integral Ad Science. And Integral Ad Science is an ad tech business. And we were kind of obsessed at the beginning with selling SaaS products. And then we couldn't really drive the value of our contracts north of $350,000. And I could feel there was frustration around the team. We're kind of stuck at this $350K ACV range and we don't know how to go higher. And then you kind of go like, okay, all right, why do you think we're stuck? It's a stupid question, right? Like, what's the different viewpoints? And then somebody says, we get stuck at the CFO level. And I'm like, oh, okay, interesting. And who's the P&L? Like, which P&L does this belong to? And it's like, well, they weren't sure. But then after some discussion, it probably goes into IT. Like, oh, wait, hang on a minute. You're selling to large advertisers. And instead of being part of working media, you end up in the IT budget. It's like, what else is in the IT budget? It was like, well, Oracle and whatever. You're like, okay. How much is in the working media budget? It's like 500x, right? And you go, okay, well, why don't we think about being part of the working media budget? And then one guy goes, yeah, they hide anything in there. Like these working media guys, they'll get whatever tools they need. It's like, okay, cool. So, but then the CFO was like, hey, if we don't get recurring revenue, we're not going to show high quality SaaS revenue. That might be a problem. So you're like, okay, well, let's take that in. It's not saying no, because it's a good argument, but let's try and eyeball what a big account like Sprint might be worth to us if we go into the IT P&L or if we go into working media. Then there was another big argument against, which was that the CPMs were dropping. And so lower CPMs meant that everybody was afraid there would be margin compression. Anyway, I'm making the story short for you. Sprint moved from being a $350,000 account a year to a $6 million account a year. And I mean, I will give myself some credit for, I think, orienting or framing that discussion. But again, I didn't do anything. I didn't have the knowledge. I was just like, all right, well, let's just unpack this thing, Who's the champion? Where does the budget go? Blah, blah, blah,
That is such a brilliant question. Which budget does this sit in? I've never thought of that before, but that really does. I can see why that's such a powerful way of thinking about it.
Okay, so just on that, what is the thing I did there? What does the world look like from the point of view of the client? That's what I did. I'm like, if you're the client, where does this thing sit? How does your P&L work? How does the internal politics work? Where does the money flow? When you're being a good board member, you're trying to sit in the shoes of the founder and looking at the world as he or she might do. And so instead of you coming in with your preconceived ideas, you're like, okay, I have a limited budget, limited number of people, limited amount of time. What is it that I can reasonably do? With what I have at my disposal, what's achievable? And it's a very different way of looking at the world than coming in and saying, I need you to hit plan. I need you to explain to me why you didn't hit plan, etc. Which is, founders know when they've missed plan. You don't need to beat them around the head with a stick. They already have been losing sleep over it for weeks. They don't need sometimes accountability matters for sure, but, typically founders are well-intentioned and hardworking, so they don't need you to come in and tell them we missed plan. They're like, yeah, no shit,
We spent a chunk of time now talking about what does good look like on boards? I'm really interested to also talk a bit about what does the not so good look like on boards. You've said that most boards suck and boards that suck destroy value. Why is that?
So boards, I would say, there's levels of dysfunction, right? So they could be merely dull. A lot of boards are just dull. They're mediocre. We're watching the weather reports from last month. Did it rain? Did it shine? Did we hit the number? And then you kind of go through this slightly performative or perfunctory exercise. And people say, oh, it'd be nice if you showed the marketing data a bit differently in the slides for next time or something. You sort of run out of time to have the big strategic discussion because we spent too long on the reporting, and then everybody goes home. So they're mostly dull. One level above, they're somewhat antagonistic. And it's an interesting thing, by the way, to think about this from a geometry standpoint. So let's say 180 is you're at one end, I'm at the other end, and we are confronting each other. The 0 degree version would be you're the absolute cheerleader and you're looking at the world in exactly the same way as me. Okay, you don't need to be 180. Sometimes you need to be confronting, but that's rare. The question is, could you be 30 degree, 45 degrees? So you could be simply asking questions. You could be steering. You could be mildly challenging. And you could be maybe sometimes at 90 degree, which would be orthogonal. Let me give you a different perspective, right? And then you could go more and more challenging. And sometimes the situation requires for you to be challenging. I've also been in boardrooms where founders are like, on some kind of LSD thinking they're going to raise insane amounts of money at crazy valuations. You have to go like, this is not a reasonable planning assumption, and you kind of have to go at it because otherwise the company is setting itself up for disaster. So on occasion, you're going to have to go confronting, but that should really be an exceptional outcome. And so one of the things I would say is, man, if people could expand their range, so it's both the range of how they interact, but also the range of the style that they bring. I'll come back to that in a second. Anyway, I find most boards are antagonists in some way, which is you're immediately going into, no, this is wrong, or why did you miss your number? Or, and we're in blame mode very quickly. We're not in diagnostic mode, or the diagnostic is poor, or we think that we are helping by challenging. And, again, sometimes you need to challenge, but rarely. I think that's usually not the best way to go. And then you get into full-on toxic board mode. And toxic boards would be misalignment of interest. I'm trying to get you on the cheap for the next round. There's a whole ways by which boards get toxic, but they could be open conflict. You're actively undermining the CEO and creating investor misalignment. There's all sorts of ways, usually cloak and daggers, Game of Thrones. Somebody's about to get killed. We just don't know who and whether it's poison or a knife. And these happen, and they especially happen in situations of crisis, which is why for me, going back to the value add stuff, I'm like, if I have somebody who's steady, transparent, reliable, professional, predictable, and they're not adding any value, I'll take that every day of the week, provided that in a crisis, they're stable, steady, patient, predictable, because at least, we're like, okay, thank you. We know what we're dealing with. And I think it's really very valuable to have people who are steadiness and calm and quiet and not bringing fear into the boardroom are high value qualities of board members.
It's interesting. That was another of the data points in that leadership training thing that was in the top 10 factors driving performance was consistency. And it's interesting that you're seeing that same thing in the boardroom as well as in the executive space.
So investors flip-flopping, very common, and it's incredibly damaging. Founders don't understand what's going on. It's a trust destroyer. Strategies have to be set carefully and pursued in a sort of compounding way over time. Pivots are exceptionally rare moments in a company, and they kind of need to be thought of carefully. But investor flip-flops it's depending on whether they got shouted at the partnership, what they read in the paper, what happened at another company. Oh my God, we need to do, this company has moved all of its customer service to AI. What are we doing? Let's divert all resources there now. And you're like, all right, interesting data point. By the way, I'm not discounting the data point, but let's just bring that into the picture and think about what we do with it.
Interesting. It reminds me a little bit of the Adam Grant framework, where I don't know if you've come across his, you've got preachers, prosecutors, politicians, and scientists. And I think what you're saying is we need in the boardroom to be more like scientists and less like the preachers and the prosecutors and politicians.
Okay, so it's a really interesting point. Talking about extend your range, different situations may require you to bring a different persona to the table. I think sometimes I will be highly analytical, passionate, systems driven. Sometimes I'll come in and do the halftime talk and go like, we have 6 months to go. How do we rally around creating a win here and, and snatching that from the jaws of defeat? Sometimes I will go full on into empathic mode, which is we just had a rough fucking time and all they need is to vent. And it's not a time to make decisions, it's not a time to push back. It's just like bring it in and I'm quote unquote holding space. And sometimes I had a case recently, we sold a company. It was really interesting because one of my co-investors who I love, but he's founder friendly kind of all the time. And we had this specific issue where the 3 founders, and they work in different countries, were all on an earn-out. So this is a 3-year earn-out deal. And they were insisting that one of them could kind of drop out and it wouldn't hurt the overall transaction structure. And they wanted that. And I'm like, guys, this is one of these cases where actually you as individually as founders are not aligned with what the company needs and the shareholder needs. So I'm going to push back. And I think they were a little bit surprised because I'm always very supportive. I'm like, this is 2 years of your life. You want to do this deal. We need a kind of joint and several commitment that you're in this together. By the way, you're protecting each other as well, but that could be a bit manipulative. So I didn't want to tell them what to think, but I'm like, certainly that's a misalignment point. And I'm actually going to push back on it because I don't think that's right. I think if you're going through this, all 3 of you through 2 years, all in, and that has to be the game. And, so this was a point where I went right against the founders. Actually, I wouldn't say it was contentious, but I mean, they had to kind of swallow it because for that, I could tell you, I'm like, if I'm representing shareholders, this is not the right thing for the company. And in that moment, that's where I had to be. So this was me with a pure shareholder. I told them, I'm like, this is me with shareholder hat on, but this is not good. And most of the time I got founder friendly hat on going, yeah, let's go team. So the extend your range thing is also what persona. That's what I meant by what is required in the moment. What persona is required in the moment. But where I'm consistent is they understand how I think, right? I'm consistent in my behavior, my thinking, my demeanor. But, whether I'm my scientific analytical, my cheerleader, or my on occasion, rarely, accountable investor type, they understand what they're dealing with, but I will bring different personas. And very often, I think people think of themselves as they're either founder friendly or they're like hard ass investor. And that you come in with your cowboy hat and the guns, or you come in with the cheerleader pack and you're one or the other. I'm like, why limit yourself? They may different things may be required on a different day. I mean, you're not an insect specialized on you're not a type of ant that's only specialized in one function. You can actually bring a range of emotions, demeanors, qualities, analytical and intuitive. So we haven't talked about the divine feminine here, but, what's going on energy wise here? What is the wisdom that is emerging in the things that are not spoken? What's being edited out? Because for men in particular, unfortunately, most of the boards that I'm on are kind of men dominated. But it's like, all we can do is like make decisions, analyze, argue, go. And sometimes you kind of go like, can we create space? Can we feel into this collectively? Like, can we shift a little bit our tempo and our energy and our way of thinking here? And I don't mean to make this gendered, but, call it the divine feminine, if you like, these different kinds of qualities.
Fred, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Perfect. I didn't read it prep, so I'll do my best.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
Okay, I'll recommend 2, but very quickly. First one is Time to Think by Nancy Klein. The other one, which I think is phenomenal, is Never Split the Difference. I forget the author, is the head FBI negotiator. just read it. It's about human nature and how to interact with and influence other humans. It will blow your mind.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Ungrounded advice I find irritating, especially when it's mixed with intellectual laziness. And the two tend to go together.
Most valuable board ritual?
I don't think boards have enough rituals. The ritual I would recommend is actually the one I mentioned earlier, which is at the beginning, when you're sort of sitting there at the board and say, this is a board. We only do this every 2 or 3 months. This is a valuable moment for all of us. What do we want to get out of it?
Your favorite quote?
I think quotes are dangerous because I don't think wisdom lives on Instagram. So quotes are abstracted of a whole lot of context. I'm going to use a brand one, which is never stop exploring, which I know is not really a quote, but for me, it's just this insane curiosity. And it also has an element of freedom. This idea of constantly seeking truth is something that served me well at least.
Most significant professional insight?
Nobody knows anything. And what I mean by that is, I think most people go through life and career using jargon and complicated words. And actually, the vast majority of folks haven't thought things through in a way that they're able to be simple, explicit, and grounded in the way they present it back to you.
Echoes of Socrates, I know that I know nothing there.
You're a better read man than me because I'm really taking mental notes of all the shit I need to go read.
Worst professional advice you ever received?
So as we said before, I think humans should be careful with the advice they provide others. However, I think every advice I receive, even if it's badly worded, if it comes from someone's intuition, is a gift. And so it is our job to parse the advice that we receive.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
And I think I used to look at boards as really purely functional. And now I realize that they are the place where culture starts to a certain extent. It's not entirely true, but they're an important place where culture lives. Let's put it that way. And that we should think of it in that manner.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
I decided this is more of an investment call that went wrong than a board call, but it's related. I decided to put more money into a company called Bother. I made a mistake I've made in the past, which is to trust a spreadsheet. You know how you think models are an accurate description of the world? And if I had tuned into my intuition, it was sort of a rational reinvestment decision to make, but my intuition was screaming at me. And I think I should have taken in all the data, all the evidence, all my beautiful systems thinking, and just sit with what I actually felt and go, I shouldn't write that check. And actually trust that. I think there was some form of deeper wisdom that was screaming at me that I ignored.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I try to the extent that's possible to be a mirror, a reflector. And I think before I was very much present and I wanted to be heard. I wanted to be recognized. I wanted people to know how great I was.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
Every interaction that is difficult or relationship issue that you run into at the board is probably going to be at a deeper level the result of you not being fully present to the person in front of you and to what's going on in the room is number 1. Number 2, it is incredibly important to leave our shit at the door as board members. If you have fear about the fact that a company is about to fail, if you're upset at a founder or whatever else it may be, I think you need to do an inventory of the feelings that belong to you. And I'm not saying ignore them, just keep them in a little basket for, for resolution at a later time. And then number 3 is, I think systems thinking really works. And what I mean by that is we tend to react to the information that's being provided to us only. And the question is always, what's being edited out? What's the bigger picture within which this information is coming to light? What's actually going on? And systems thinking really helps you elevate yourself from just looking at evidence, sort of breadcrumbs of data, and understand the bigger narrative, the bigger picture, the bigger mechanics. And so I think that's incredibly valuable, especially for board members, because our information's asymmetric and it's imperfect.
Fred, that has been an absolute treat. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much, Ollie.
If today's guest has got you thinking about your own board journey, Neural Plus, our premium level book of membership, is there to guide you with expert support, personalised feedback, and a much wider pool of board opportunities to explore. Listeners get 10% off. Head to plus.neural.com and use code ENTER at checkout.